The alarm in my skull is not real, but I wake up shaking anyway. My claws are dug into the sleeping mat, and my breathing comes in short pulls, the way it used to come when the sky over Thren was falling apart. I am not on Thren. I am in my quiet home on the colony world of Esra, decades after the war ended, and the only sound outside my window is the wind moving through blue grass. Still, my body has not caught up with the peace. My body remembers the moon. My name is Skarn Vaith. I was a soldier of the Tholan Expeditionary Force, and I fought against the humans for 6 years during what our histories now call the Long Correction. I am retired now. I have a small house, a garden that refuses to grow anything useful, and a mind that will not let me rest. Every few nights, the same memory returns, dressed differently each time, but always leading to the same place. A frozen base, a handful of humans, and a silence that I have never been able to explain to anyone who was not there. I get up and walk to the window. The twin moons of Esra hang low tonight, pale and calm, nothing like the moon I dream about. I press my hand against the cool glass and try to slow my heartbeat the way the healers taught me. In and out. Count to 10. Remember that the war is over. Remember that I am safe. It does not work tonight. It rarely does. I was proud once, long before Thren, long before I understood what I was truly walking into. When I was young, my people believed something simple and clean about warfare. We believed that strength ends conflict quickly. If you show an enemy that resistance is hopeless, they lay down their arms and everyone can go home. It is a merciful idea in its own way. Overwhelming force is supposed to be a kindness because it shortens suffering. That is what I was taught. That is what every young Tholan recruit is taught, even now. Humans did not understand that lesson, or perhaps they understood it perfectly and chose not to follow it. I did not know that yet on the night I am remembering. I was younger then, still certain of my training, still certain that courage and math went hand in hand. 5 of us for every one of them. That should have been the end of the story before it began. It was not. I sit down at my kitchen table because standing makes the memory feel too close, like it is happening in the room with me. I pour a cup of warm nectar root tea, a human habit I picked up long after the fighting stopped, and I let the memory come, because fighting it only makes the nights longer. The base was called Camp Halden by the humans, though we never learned that until much later, from records recovered after the war. To us, it was simply the outpost on the moon of Thren, a small, half-buried structure clinging to a frozen ridge, surrounded by nothing but ice fields and dark sky. We were told it held a communications relay and a small defensive garrison. Command believed we would take it within a single rotation. I remember standing at the ridgeline with my unit, looking down at the outpost through the visor of my cold suit. The human structure looked fragile from a distance, low and gray against the endless white. I remember feeling something close to sympathy for them. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from any reinforcement. In my mind, the fight was already finished. I imagined we would walk down, offer terms, and the humans inside would understand the numbers as clearly as we did. I did not yet know that humans do not always fight with numbers in mind. My unit commander, a scarred old soldier named Threx Ondil, gave the order to advance at first light, though light on Thren only means the sky turns from black to a duller shade of gray. We moved down the ridge in formation, disciplined and unhurried, the way we always moved, confident that confidence itself would be enough. The first thing that told me something was wrong was the silence. No warning shots, no frightened voices over comm channels, no sign of panic, just cold wind and the quiet crunch of our boots on old snow. Then the ridge lit up beneath us. Not with attacks, not yet, but with lights. Small lights, dozens of them, blinking on inside the base, methodical and calm, like the humans inside were simply going about their morning. I remember pausing, unsettled by how ordinary it looked. My people expect fear to show itself. We expect trembling hands and desperate voices when the odds are this uneven. What I saw instead was routine, Humans moving through their base like it was any other day, checking equipment, adjusting comm arrays, preparing positions without a hint of despair in their movements. It should have told me everything I needed to know. It did not yet. I was still thinking in numbers. We reached the outer perimeter without incident, and Commander Ondil sent the standard message, translated by our linguistic units, into the human tongue. Surrender your position. Your survival is assured if you comply. I remember the words traveling out over the frozen air, crisp and confident, exactly as they had worked on a dozen other worlds before this one. There was a pause, then a voice came back, calm and almost friendly, belonging to a human woman whose name I would not learn until years later. She said only this: "We appreciate the offer, but we have work to do here, perhaps another time." I remember looking at my fellow soldiers, and I remember seeing the same confusion on their faces that I felt in my own chest. It was not defiance in her voice. It was not anger. It sounded like she was declining an invitation to a meal she was too busy to attend. Commander Ondil ordered us to hold position and wait for further instruction from the fleet above. I remember standing there in the freezing wind, staring down at that small gray base, feeling for the first time a small crack form in the clean, simple idea I had carried with me since basic training. Overwhelming force was supposed to end this. It was supposed to be over already. It was not over. It had barely begun. That night, our first losses came, not from a direct attack, but from something none of us expected. Small charges, placed with patience and precision, went off beneath two of our forward vehicles, disabling them without harming a single soldier inside. It was not meant to kill. It was meant to slow us down, to cost us time and resources, to make the operation expensive before it truly started. I remember Commander Ondil studying the reports with a stillness in his eyes that I had never seen in him before. He had fought in a dozen campaigns. He had faced entrenched positions and desperate last stands. But this, he said quietly, this feels different. I did not understand what he meant then. I understand it now, after all these years of dreaming about it. The humans were not trying to survive that night. They were trying to make their eventual loss, if it came, mean something. They were trying to leave a mark that outlasted the battle itself. I finish my tea, and the cup feels heavier in my hand than it should. Outside, the twin moons have shifted slightly, and somewhere in the blue grass, a night insect begins to sing, a small, ordinary sound that pulls me gently back into the present. I am on Esra. I am safe. The moon of Thren is far away, and the war that broke my simple ideas about strength and mercy ended a long time ago. But the memory is not finished with me yet. It rarely lets go this quickly. I know that if I try to sleep now, I will only return to that ridge, to that gray base, to that first quiet warning that something about the humans did not fit inside anything my training had prepared me for. I decide not to fight it tonight. I sit at my table, wrapped in the stillness of my small house, and I let my mind walk back down that frozen ridge one more time, because I have learned, slowly and painfully, that the only way through these memories is to walk all the way to the end of them and see what waits there, instead of turning away before I reach the truth I have been avoiding for years. Before Thren, before the moon that visits my dreams almost every week, there was a younger version of me who believed war was a simple equation. I want to walk through those early days now, because without them, nothing that happened later would make any sense. I enlisted in the Tholen Expeditionary Force at the age most of us do, barely past my early growth stage, eager to prove myself useful to the pack of my homeworld. Our culture is built around collective strength. We do not celebrate the lone hero. We celebrate the unit that moves together, the formation that never breaks, the idea that safety comes from numbers and discipline rather than individual daring. It is a good way to build an army. It is also, I would learn, a poor way to predict how humans behave. My training was thorough. I learned to read a battlefield the way our commanders had read 100 battlefields before mine. Overwhelming force, applied early and applied completely, was supposed to shorten every conflict. show the enemy the shape of their defeat before it happens, and they will choose to survive rather than resist. This was not cruelty in our eyes. It was mercy dressed in strategy. Our instructors told us that a quick surrender saved more lives than a drawn-out fight ever could, and I believed them completely, because every campaign before the humans proved them right. We fought several other species in the years before the humans arrived in our records. I will not list them all, but I remember the pattern clearly. We would arrive with superior numbers, present clear terms, and within a short time, resistance would end. Sometimes there were difficult stretches. Sometimes there were losses on both sides, but the shape of the conflict always matched what our doctrine predicted. Strength shown early meant a shorter war. The first time I heard the word human, it was inside a briefing room aboard a mid-sized carrier ship called the Ashen Veil, 3 years into my service. Our fleet had encountered a small colony belonging to an unfamiliar species during a routine expansion survey. The initial contact had gone poorly, though not through any deliberate act of ours. A miscommunication near a resource outpost escalated into a short exchange of fire, and within days, what should have been a minor incident had grown into the beginning of a war that would last far longer than any of us expected. I remember the briefing officer showing us images of the species for the first time. They looked strange to us, soft-skinned, oddly proportioned, without the layered plating most warrior species in our records carried. My first instinct, and I remember this honestly because it embarrasses me now, was that they looked fragile. I remember thinking this would be a short campaign. Our first encounters seemed to confirm that thought. Early battles followed the pattern we expected. Humans defended positions, we advanced with superior coordination and equipment, and within days, most conflicts ended with human forces withdrawing or surrendering outposts that could not be reasonably held. I remember feeling a kind of quiet confidence settle over our command structure. This was simply another campaign, another species that would eventually understand the arithmetic of the situation. It was during the 3rd month of the campaign that I first noticed something did not fit the pattern. We had taken a small human research outpost on a moon near their border territory, a place with no strategic value beyond its location. The garrison there was small, perhaps 30 soldiers, facing nearly 200 of ours. By every measure we understood, this should have been resolved within hours. It took 4 days. I remember standing guard near the outpost's outer wall during the 2nd night, listening to something drifting faintly through the cold air. At first, I thought it was a malfunction in our own communication equipment, some strange frequency bleeding through the static. Then I realized it was coming from inside the human position. It was singing. Not a battle cry, not a defiant shout meant to unsettle us. Just quiet, steady singing, several voices together, carrying a simple melody through the freezing dark. I remember standing there, confused, trying to understand why soldiers facing near certain defeat would spend their limited energy on something so unnecessary. I asked my unit's translator afterward what the words meant. She told me it was an old human song, one meant to be sung by many voices in difficult places, meant to remind the singers that they were not truly alone even when surrounded. I remember turning that idea over in my mind for a long time, because among my own people, songs are for celebration, for rest, for peace. The idea of using a song as a shield against fear was something I had never considered. By the 4th day, the outpost fell, as we always knew it would, but the way it fell stayed with me. The human commander, an older man with graying hair and calm eyes, walked out to meet our forces personally, ahead of his soldiers, without any weapon raised. I remember Commander Ondil, who was overseeing that operation as well, asking him through the translator why he had waited so long to accept the inevitable outcome. The human commander answered simply. He said that giving up early costs a soldier something that cannot be measured in casualties. He said his people believed it was worth holding a position as long as it served a purpose, even a small one, even simply to test an enemy's patience or slow their advance by a single day. He said none of his soldiers regretted the choice, even in defeat. I remember Commander Ondil studying him for a long moment before ordering the standard processing of prisoners. I remember thinking, foolishly, that this was simply one unusual commander, one exception in an otherwise predictable war. The next incident that stayed with me came only a few weeks later, during a different operation entirely. We had captured a wounded human soldier following a skirmish over a contested supply route. He was brought aboard our medical vessel for treatment, in accordance with standard protocols governing captured combatants. I remember visiting the medical bay out of simple curiosity, wanting to see this species up close, without the tension of a battlefield between us. The human soldier, a young man with a bandaged shoulder and tired eyes, looked up when I entered. I expected fear, or perhaps quiet hatred, given that I represented the very forces that had wounded him. Instead, he offered something I did not expect at all. He thanked me. I remember standing there, confused, unsure how to respond. Our translator, present for medical monitoring, relayed his words carefully. He said he was grateful for a fight that tested him, grateful that his side had managed to hold their position long enough to protect a supply convoy carrying medical equipment to a nearby settlement. He said the wound did not matter, because the convoy had made it through. I asked him, through the translator, whether he wished the battle had never happened at all. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something I have never forgotten. He said that avoiding every difficult fight was its own kind of defeat, one that cost a person more than any wound ever could. I did not understand him then. I am not certain I fully understand him now, though I have thought about his words more times than I can count over the years since. My people are taught that conflict is something to end as quickly and completely as possible, because prolonging it only causes needless cost. Humans, it seemed, measured cost differently. For them, some things were worth more than comfort, worth more than safety, worth more even than the outcome of the fight itself. I brought my confusion to Commander Ondil that evening, hoping he could explain what I had witnessed. He listened carefully, as he always did, and then he told me something that I carried with me for the rest of the war. He said that every species we had fought before understood defeat as an ending. Humans, he said, seemed to understand defeat as simply another kind of beginning. I did not know then how deeply that idea would prove itself, nor how much it would cost both sides before the war reached its true turning point. I did not know that within the year I would stand on a frozen ridge overlooking a small gray outpost on a moon called Thren, watching a handful of human soldiers refuse to behave the way 5 decades of Tholan military doctrine promised me they would. I thought I understood humans by then. I thought the singing, the gratitude, the strange definitions of victory and defeat were simply cultural oddities, interesting but ultimately manageable within the larger shape of the war. I believed, as my commanders believed, that enough force applied at the right moment would still bring any human position to a reasonable end. Thren would teach me otherwise, in a way I have never fully recovered from, even after all these years of peace. I remember, sitting now in my quiet house on Esra with the twin moons rising higher outside my window, that the version of myself who stood on that ridge for the first time still believed in the clean arithmetic of overwhelming force. I remember how confident I felt, how certain that the numbers alone would settle everything before the day was through. I did not yet understand that some equations do not balance the way you expect, no matter how carefully you calculate them. I would learn that lesson soon enough, in the cold and the silence of that small, stubborn base, in a chapter of my service that I have spent years trying to make peace with, and have only recently begun to understand at all. The moon of Thren was cold in a way that felt personal, as if the ice itself had decided to test every soldier who walked across it. I remember the first morning clearly, standing at the ridge with Commander Ondil beside me, looking down at the small gray outpost that our fleet analysts promised would fall within a single rotation. 5 of us for every one of them, we were told. A simple operation, a short chapter in a long campaign. I want to walk through what happened over those 11 days carefully, because for years I could only remember it in fragments, sharp and disconnected, the way trauma often stores itself. It has taken me a long time, and many quiet nights like this one, to put the pieces back in their proper order. The first day passed mostly in preparation. We established a perimeter around the outpost, confirmed its limited defenses through long-range scans, and sent our formal request for surrender, the same request that had worked so many times before. The answer came back calm and almost pleasant, delivered by the woman whose voice I would hear in my memory for the rest of my life. "We appreciate the offer, but we have work to do here." Commander Ondil ordered patience. He believed, as most of us did, that a show of overwhelming presence would eventually convince the garrison to reconsider. We held position through the first night, watching the small lights of the outpost blink steadily in the darkness, disciplined and unhurried, exactly as they had been the moment we arrived. The disabling charges came before dawn on the second day, placed with a precision that told us this was not a desperate act, but a deliberate one. 2 of our forward vehicles were rendered useless without a single soldier harmed. I remember Commander Ondil studying the reports with the same stillness I described before, the stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the operation ahead of him. By the third day, it became clear that the humans inside Camp Halden were not simply waiting to be overwhelmed. They were actively shaping the battlefield around them, using the terrain, the cold, and their limited resources with a patience that unsettled even our most experienced officers. Small groups would appear briefly along the ridgelines, disrupt our supply movements, and disappear again before we could properly respond. It was never enough to change the outcome of the siege, not by itself, but it was enough to slow us, to cost us time, equipment, and confidence. I remember asking Commander Ondil, during a quiet moment on the 4th night, why the humans continued resisting when the numbers made their position clearly impossible. He did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, he said something that has stayed with me ever since. He said that humans did not seem to measure a fight only by whether it could be won. They seemed to measure it by what the fight cost the other side, no matter the final outcome. I did not fully understand what he meant until the 6th day, when we lost our first real ground to a tactic none of our training had prepared us for. The humans had rigged a section of the outer supply route with a series of small, controlled collapses, timed to trigger only after a significant portion of our forces had already committed to the path. It was not designed to overwhelm us, only to delay us, to force a full day of rerouting and repair while their limited numbers rested and regrouped inside the base. I remember standing at the edge of the collapsed route, staring at the damage, feeling something shift inside me that I could not name at the time. It was not fear exactly, it was closer to disbelief. By the 7th day, the toll on both sides had grown heavier than anyone anticipated. Our medical teams were stretched thin, treating injuries from encounters that should never have happened against a force this small. I remember visiting the medical tents that evening, watching soldiers far more experienced than me sit quietly, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of an enemy who refused to behave the way every previous campaign had taught us to expect. Commander Ondil called a private meeting of senior officers that night, and though I was not part of that meeting, I learned much of what was discussed in the years since, through records released after the war ended. He argued that the operation needed to change its approach entirely, that continuing to apply the same overwhelming pressure was only feeding whatever resolve kept the garrison fighting. Others argued that increasing pressure was the only path forward, that any hesitation would simply prolong the cost even further. In the end, command chose to escalate. I remember the 8th day most clearly of all, because it was the day I finally understood, in a way I could not unlearn afterward, what Commander Ondil had meant about humans measuring a fight differently than we did. Our forces advanced with full coordinated pressure, moving to finally close the distance between the ridge and the outpost itself. I remember the tension in every soldier around me, the disciplined silence that comes right before a large coordinated action. I remember believing, for the last time in my life, that this would finally be the moment the garrison chose to surrender. Instead, the humans met our advance with a defense unlike anything documented in our previous campaigns. They did not simply hold their position. They used every remaining resource, every piece of terrain, every ounce of preparation they had built over the previous week, to make our advance as costly as possible, even while clearly understanding that the outpost itself could not ultimately be held against our numbers. I remember a moment, in the middle of that long and difficult day, when I found myself separated briefly from my unit, taking cover behind a ridge of broken ice near the outer wall of the base. From where I crouched, I could see into a section of the outpost through a damaged viewport, and for a few seconds, I watched the humans inside working together, calm and coordinated, treating their wounded, redistributing their limited supplies, speaking to one another in short, steady sentences that our translator later described as words of encouragement rather than despair. I remember thinking, in that strange suspended moment, that I was not watching a garrison waiting to lose. I was watching people who had already decided how they wanted their resistance to be remembered, regardless of the outcome that awaited them. By the 9th day, the outpost's outer defenses had largely fallen, and our forces held most of the perimeter, and yet resistance continued from within, slower now, more limited, but no less deliberate. I remember Commander Ondil ordering a pause in our advance, hoping that the visible collapse of their outer defenses would finally prompt the surrender that our doctrine still insisted was inevitable. The response, when it came, was the same calm voice we had heard on the very first day. "We understand our position. We are not finished yet." I remember the frustration that spread through our ranks at those words. Frustration mixed with something closer to a grudging respect that none of us quite knew how to process. We had overwhelming numbers. We had complete control of the outer perimeter. And still, the humans inside continued to make every step forward cost us something. The 10th day brought the final assault on the inner structure of the outpost, the last section still under human control. I remember moving through narrow, frozen corridors with the rest of my unit, expecting at any moment to find the remaining defenders finally ready to lay down their resistance. What we found instead, in the final chamber of the outpost, was the human commander whose calm voice had answered every one of our demands throughout the siege. She stood near a communications console, her uniform worn and marked by 11 days of continuous defense, her expression steady despite everything that had brought her to that final moment. I remember Commander Ondil stepping forward, offering one last opportunity for peaceful resolution, one final chance to end the standoff without further cost to either side. I remember her listening carefully, without any trace of anger or despair in her posture, before she answered him directly. She said that her orders had been to protect the information stored within that outpost for as long as possible, and that she had done exactly that, for 11 full days beyond what any reasonable calculation would have predicted. She said she was ready for the standoff to end, but that ending it would happen on terms that protected what she had been sent there to protect. I remember the silence that followed her words, a silence heavier than anything I had experienced in 6 years of service. And then, before Commander Ondil could respond, she activated a final safeguard built into the outpost's core systems, a controlled shutdown designed to destroy the sensitive information housed there rather than allow it to fall into our hands. I want to be careful here because this is the part of the memory that returns most often in my dreams, and I have spent years trying to describe it honestly without letting the horror of that moment overwhelm the deeper truth hidden inside it. The shutdown was not an act of anger, nor a final desperate strike against us. It was, as strange as it may sound, an act of duty, carried out calmly, deliberately, and without hesitation by someone who had already decided, long before we arrived, exactly how far she was willing to go to complete the task she had been given. Several of our soldiers were caught within the outpost structure when the safeguard activated, and the outcome for them was severe. I will not describe the details further because they do not belong in a story meant to help others understand rather than to relive suffering for its own sake. What matters, What has stayed with me every day since is not the loss itself, but the calm certainty behind it. I remember standing outside the outpost afterward, staring at the wreckage under Thren's pale gray sky, surrounded by soldiers who had expected, right up until the final moment, that overwhelming numbers would eventually bring this operation to the same clean, predictable ending that every previous campaign had promised us. Instead, we stood in the aftermath of something none of our training had prepared us to understand. Commander Ondil said very little in the hours that followed. I remember him standing near the edge of the ridge for a long time, staring down at the ruins below, before finally turning to the gathered soldiers and saying only this. He said that we had won the ground, but that the cost of winning it would follow every one of us for a very long time. He was right, though it would take me many years and many long nights like this one, sitting quietly in my home on Esra, to understand exactly what he meant. The moon of Thren did not teach me that humans were dangerous simply because they fought fiercely. It taught me something far more difficult to accept. It taught me that humans measured victory and defeat by a different standard entirely, one built not around survival alone, but around the value of resolve itself, carried all the way to its final, unavoidable conclusion. I did not know, standing on that frozen ridge all those years ago, that this single, difficult lesson would eventually become the foundation of everything I would come to understand about peace, about respect, and about the strange, complicated species that had once been my enemy, and would one day, against every expectation I carried with me off that ridge, become something closer to a people I could finally understand. The morning after that particular nightmare, I received a message through the community terminal in my kitchen, inviting me to a memorial gathering being held at the old defense hall near the center of Esra's main settlement. I almost declined, as I usually do with these invitations, because memorial gatherings tend to stir up exactly the memories I spend most of my energy trying to quiet. But something about the wording of this particular message caught my attention. It mentioned that guests from the reconciliation program would be attending, including several elderly human veterans who had served during the same period of the war I remembered so vividly. I sat with that information for a long time before deciding to go. Curiosity and dread rarely feel very different from each other, and that morning I could not tell which one was pulling me toward the defense hall. The gathering was smaller than I expected, held in a wide, quiet room with tall windows overlooking the bluegrass fields outside. Solon veterans, mixed cautiously with colony administrators and a handful of younger residents who had never experienced the war firsthand. And near the far end of the room, seated together at a modest table, were three humans, gray-haired and steady, wearing simple clothing rather than any military uniform. I remember feeling my chest tighten the moment I saw them, an old, familiar reaction that I had never fully managed to shake, even decades removed from the fighting. I stood near the entrance for a long while, uncertain whether I belonged in that room at all, until one of the human veterans, a woman with short silver hair and calm, steady eyes, looked up and noticed me standing there. She rose from her seat, walked over without hesitation, and introduced herself simply as Grace. She said she had served during the later years of the war, primarily in support and coordination roles, though she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had once been stationed near the border territory where much of the fiercest fighting took place. I remember standing there, unsure how to respond, caught somewhere between old training and the strange, uncertain peace that had settled over both our peoples in the years since. She must have noticed my hesitation, because she said something that surprised me. She said that she understood if being in this room was difficult for me, and that she did not expect forced conversation or forgiveness neatly wrapped into a single afternoon. She said she was simply here to listen, if I ever wanted to speak. I did not speak much that first day. I remember standing near the edge of the gathering, watching quietly as veterans from both sides exchanged careful, measured conversation, some warmer than others, some barely more than polite silence shared across a shrinking distance. I left early, unsettled by how much the encounter had stirred inside me, though I could not yet explain exactly why. It was nearly 2 weeks before I returned to the defense hall, drawn back by something I still cannot fully name, though I suspect it had something to do with the calm way Grace had looked at me that first day, without fear, without hostility, simply present. She was there again when I arrived, seated near the same window, watching the blue grass move gently outside. I remember approaching slowly, still uncertain, before finally sitting down across from her, without quite deciding to do so. I asked her, carefully at first, whether she had ever served near a moon called Thren. I remember watching her expression shift slightly, not with surprise exactly, but with recognition. She said she had not been stationed there herself, but that she remembered the name well from reports that had circulated afterward, describing an outpost that had held far longer than anyone expected against a vastly larger force. I told her, slowly and with some difficulty, that I had been part of that force. I told her about the 11 days, about the singing I had once heard drifting through the cold night air during an earlier campaign, about the wounded soldier who had thanked me instead of resenting me, about the final calm voice that had answered every one of our demands without a trace of fear. I asked her the question that had haunted me for decades, the question I had never been able to answer on my own. I asked her why humans continued fighting long after the numbers made victory impossible. I asked her why giving up, when giving up clearly meant survival, seemed to matter so little compared to holding a position that could not ultimately be held. Grace was quiet for a long moment before she answered. She said that humans, throughout much of their history, had learned a difficult lesson about fear, one that shaped much of how they approached conflict even in the modern era. She said that fear, left unchecked, has a way of making every decision on a person's behalf, long before any actual danger fully arrives. She said her people had learned, sometimes at great cost, that letting fear choose for you, rather than choosing deliberately for yourself, often led to outcomes far worse than the original danger ever posed. She said that when a human soldier chose to continue defending a position long after surrender might have seemed the safer option, it was rarely about hatred for the enemy standing before them. It was about refusing to let fear make that decision, instead of the soldier making it themselves, deliberately, with full understanding of the cost involved. I remember sitting with that explanation for a long time, turning it over carefully, trying to fit it against everything I had witnessed on that frozen ridge so many years before. It did not erase the memory. It did not undo the loss that both sides carried away from that siege. But it gave the memory a shape I had never been able to see clearly before, a shape built not around cruelty or recklessness, but around a fierce, deliberate respect for the idea of choosing one's own path, even when that path led somewhere difficult. I asked her whether she had ever lost someone close to her during the war, half expecting the question to close the conversation entirely. Instead, she answered honestly, telling me about a young soldier she had served alongside early in her career, someone who had died defending a supply route very similar to the kind of position I remembered from my own early campaigns. She said she had carried that loss for a long time, much the way I had carried the memory of Thren, and that meeting veterans from the other side of the war, slowly and carefully through the reconciliation program, had helped her find a way to place that loss somewhere she could finally rest with it. I told her, somewhat hesitantly, about Commander Ondil, about the quiet way he had stood at the edge of that ridge after the siege ended, about the words he had spoken regarding the true cost of the ground we had won that day. Grace listened carefully, without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me ever since. She said that every war leaves behind soldiers on both sides who understand something true about the other, something that could never have been learned any other way, and that perhaps the only way to make that terrible cost mean something afterward was to actually carry that understanding forward, rather than letting it fade quietly into forgotten history. We spoke for a long while after that, moving slowly through easier subjects, comparing small details about our very different lives before the war, about the strange, quiet adjustment both our peoples had made in the decades since peace finally took hold. I remember feeling, for the first time in longer than I could easily measure, something close to ease in a conversation about the war, rather than the familiar tightness that usually accompanied any memory of that period. Before I left the defense hall that day, Grace mentioned that the reconciliation program held regular gatherings throughout the following months, and she invited me to return, without any pressure attached to the invitation. I told her I would think about it honestly, rather than offering an easy answer I did not yet feel certain of. Walking home that evening, beneath the pale light of Esra's twin moons, I found myself thinking not about the siege itself, but about Grace's explanation of fear, about the idea that choosing your own path deliberately, even a difficult one, matters more to humans than simple survival ever could. I thought about the wounded soldier who had thanked me instead of resenting me, about the singing I had once heard drifting through frozen air, about the calm, steady voice that had answered every demand we made without ever raising in anger or falling into despair. For the first time since that ridge, so many years ago, I found myself thinking about the moon of Thren, not with the old, familiar dread that usually accompanied the memory, but with something closer to a difficult, complicated respect, one I was only beginning to understand, and one I suspected would take the rest of my life to fully make peace with. I did not know yet, walking home that evening, exactly how much further that understanding would carry me in the months ahead, nor how much it would eventually change the way I carried the weight of that memory forward. I only knew that something inside me, something that had been closed off and guarded since the day the outpost fell, had finally begun, slowly and carefully, to open. Months passed after that first real conversation with Grace, and I found myself returning to the defense hall more often than I ever expected when I first hesitated at its entrance. Each visit chipped away, slowly and carefully, at the wall I had built around the memory of Thren, not by erasing what happened there, but by helping me understand it well enough to finally set it down without losing myself in the process. I want to describe one particular evening that I believe marks the true turning point in all of this, because it was the night I finally understood what my long years of nightmares had actually been trying to tell me. It was late in the season, and the gathering that evening was smaller than usual, just a handful of veterans from both sides sharing a quiet meal in the defense hall's modest dining area. Grace was there, along with another human veteran named Peter, an older man with a steady voice and an easy, patient manner. I remember sitting near the window with them, watching the last light fade over the blue grass fields, feeling more settled in that room than I had ever expected to feel in the years since the war ended. Peter had served, I learned that evening, in a different sector entirely from Grace and from the campaign I remembered, but his stories carried the same familiar thread running through them. He spoke about a defensive position his unit had held far longer than any reasonable calculation suggested they should, about the quiet decision his commanding officer had made to continue holding a difficult line, not out of recklessness, but out of a deliberate, considered choice to make the eventual outcome, whatever it turned out to be, mean something beyond simple survival. I remember asking him, gently, whether he ever resented that decision, whether some part of him wished his commander had simply chosen the safer path instead. He considered the question carefully before answering, the way Grace often did, taking his time rather than offering an easy response. He said that resentment was not really the right word for what he carried away from that experience. He said what he carried instead was a kind of quiet pride, difficult to explain to anyone who had not stood in that position themselves. A pride built around the idea that his side had faced an impossible situation and chosen, deliberately and with full understanding, exactly how they wanted to meet it. I remember sitting with his words for a long moment, feeling something shift quietly inside me, the same slow unlocking I had first felt during my early conversations with Grace, but deeper this time, more complete. I told them both, for the first time in full detail, exactly what I had witnessed in that final chamber of the outpost on Thren, the calm certainty in the human commander's voice, the steady way she had explained her orders before activating the safeguard that ended the siege. I told them about the years of nightmares that followed, about the way that single moment had shaped nearly every aspect of how I understood humans afterward, coloring my caution, my distance, my quiet fear that I had never fully managed to name until sitting in that very room. Grace listened carefully, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me every day since. She said that the commander I described sounded exactly like someone who understood precisely what Peter had just described, someone who had faced an impossible position and chosen, with full clarity, exactly how she wanted her final act to be remembered. She said that from everything I had described, it did not sound like cruelty, nor recklessness, nor hatred toward the soldiers standing outside that outpost. It sounded like duty, carried all the way to its final conclusion, deliberately and without regret, because the alternative, allowing fear to dictate a quieter, safer ending, was simply not a choice that Commander was willing to accept for herself. I remember feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for longer than I could easily measure, a tightness I had carried since that frozen ridge so many years before, one that had shaped nearly every quiet hour I had spent alone with my memories since. It did not erase the loss. It did not undo the difficult cost that both sides carried away from that siege, but it finally gave me a way to hold the memory without letting it hold me in return. I returned home that evening, later than usual, walking slowly beneath Esra's twin moons, turning the conversation over carefully in my mind. I thought about Commander Ondil, about the quiet words he had spoken at the edge of that ridge so many years before, about the true cost of the ground we had won that day. I understood, finally and completely, exactly what he had meant, though it had taken me decades and an unlikely friendship with a human veteran to fully grasp it. He had meant that we had defeated an outpost, but we had not defeated the resolve that outpost represented, because that resolve was never truly ours to defeat in the first place. It belonged entirely to the humans who carried it, deliberately and without regret, all the way to whatever end they had chosen for themselves. In the months that followed, I found myself returning to the defense hall regularly, no longer out of uncertain curiosity, but out of a genuine desire to understand more fully the species I had once faced across that frozen ridge. I met other veterans, both Tholan and human, each carrying their own version of the same difficult lesson, each slowly finding their own way toward whatever peace they could make with it. Eventually, the reconciliation program asked whether any veterans would be willing to speak with younger Tholan recruits, sharing lessons learned from the war in the hope of preventing similar misunderstandings in the future, should any new conflict ever arise between our peoples. I remember hesitating for a long time before agreeing, uncertain whether I had anything useful to offer beyond my own difficult memories. I spoke to my first group of young recruits on a clear morning, standing before a room of eager, disciplined young Tholans who reminded me sharply of the soldier I had once been, standing confidently on that ridge, certain that overwhelming numbers alone would settle everything before the day was through. I did not tell them that humans were dangerous, though many of them expected that lesson going in. Instead, I told them what Grace had taught me, carefully and patiently, over many quiet conversations in that defense hall. I told them that humans were not driven by recklessness or hatred, but by a fierce, deliberate refusal to let fear make their decisions for them. I told them that respecting this quality, rather than underestimating it, was the only way to ensure that any future peace between our peoples remained lasting and genuine. I told them about the outpost on Thren, about the 11 days that outpost held against overwhelming odds, about the calm, steady voice that answered every demand we made without ever wavering. I told them that the lesson of that siege was not about the danger humans posed on a battlefield, but about the depth of resolve hidden beneath their calm, ordinary exterior, a resolve that deserved genuine respect rather than simple caution. I remember watching their faces as I spoke, seeing the same confident certainty I once carried myself slowly giving way to something more thoughtful, more careful, exactly the shift I hoped my words might help bring about. That night, Walking home from the training hall where I had spoken, I found myself thinking about the moon of Thren one final time before sleep finally came for me. I thought about the frozen ridge, about the small gray outpost below, about the 11 long days that had shaped nearly every year of my life since. I thought about Grace, about Peter, about the quiet understanding we had slowly built together across a distance that once seemed impossible to cross. I fell asleep easily that night, for the first time in longer than I could remember, and when the dream came, as it always did, it arrived differently than it ever had before. I stood once more on that frozen ridge, looking down at the small gray outpost, but the dread that usually accompanied the memory had softened into something quieter, something closer to understanding than fear. I watched the outpost hold through those 11 days, one final time, watched the calm voice answer every demand without wavering, watched the final quiet act that had haunted me for so many years unfold exactly as it always had. But this time, I did not wake shaking, gripping my sleeping mat with trembling claws. This time, I simply watched, understanding at last exactly what I was witnessing. Not cruelty, not recklessness, not senseless resistance against impossible odds. I was witnessing the last honest moment of a war fought between two very different peoples, each carrying their own understanding of strength, of mercy, of what it truly means to choose your own path when every easier option has already been taken away. I woke the next morning to sunlight moving gently across my kitchen table, the twin moons long since faded into the pale blue sky of another ordinary day on Esra. My hands were steady, my breathing was calm, and for the first time since that frozen ridge so many years before, I felt something close to peace settle quietly over the memory that had haunted me for the better part of my life. I do not know whether every nightmare will stay away for good, nor whether the moon of Thren will always appear in my dreams with the same quiet understanding it carried that particular night. But I know now, finally and completely, exactly what that memory has been trying to teach me all along. Some fights are never truly about who holds the ground when the fighting finally ends. Some fights are about who chooses, deliberately and without regret, exactly how they wish to meet whatever comes, refusing to let fear decide it for them instead. That lesson cost both our peoples more than either side ever expected to pay, but carrying it forward, carefully and honestly, into whatever peace still lies ahead of us, feels like the only way to make certain that cost was not paid for nothing at all.